Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
The night I learned my sister had told everyone not to invite me to the Hawaii Christmas trip, I was sitting on my kitchen floor with a half-folded stack of bath towels and a mug of tea that had gone cold. Because sometimes your hands keep moving the way they always have while your brain stares at a single sentence on a glowing screen and tries to make it less insulting by blinking at it, which, for the record, never works. The sentence sat there in the family thread like a planted flag. Let's keep it small this year, just the successful ones, and please don't make it awkward by looping Emily in. And even though I wasn't supposed to be in the thread at all, because apparently there had been a newer, shinier group chat without me. My aunt had forwarded a screenshot with the kind of accidental precision only a well-meaning relative can achieve, and there it was, my name wrapped in that sweetly poisonous packaging my sister Megan has perfected since we shared a bathroom, and she wrote, "Labels are for the disorganized on my side of the mirror with lip liner." I let the sentence sit there longer than it deserved, and while I watched the cursor hover over it like a moth, I could hear my late-night neighborhood doing that hushed winter thing, a dog collar clinking against a water bowl, a car door shutting 2 houses down, the heat groaning to life like an old man who refuses a cane, and I realized that not a single person in that thread had said, "Hold on, that's cruel," or even the watered-down version people prefer, the one that sounds like concern, but smells like fear. Maybe we should talk to her. Because silence, in this family, has always been our favorite wrapping paper. We use it for birthdays, for apologies, for the awkward hour after Thanksgiving when someone reminds Mom she said she'd help with tuition and Mom reminds everyone that I am doing fine on my own, which is family code for good at cleaning up other people's messes and too polite to mention it. I didn't throw the phone, which is personal growth, and I didn't cry, which is a different kind of growth I don't always trust, and I didn't even call Megan, because a conversation with her is like ordering a salad that arrives as a performance art piece. A lot of garnish, no food, and instead I did what I always do when the ground tilts under my feet. I stood up, returned the towels to their neat stacks, put the cold tea in the sink, and began inventorying the facts of my life with the same calm tone I use when I'm balancing the guest house bills that Megan and her husband Tom still intend to cover once things stabilize, a phrase that has stretched across 3 seasons like gum on a shoe. The facts were simple enough. They had excluded me. My parents had gone along with it, and the person I had been for years, the shock absorber, the extra key under the mat, the person who fixes, had 2 choices now, and only one of them left me with any self-respect I could sleep beside. The hook of that night, the thing that clicked in my chest like a safe unlocking, wasn't the betrayal itself. You don't get to my age in this family without learning that being useful does not guarantee being wanted, but the precision of the phrasing, that I would make it awkward, because it told me the truth I'd been skirting for years, that my presence, with my boundaries and my inconvenient memory of who borrowed what and who promised when, had become a mirror they couldn't stand, and since they couldn't change the reflection, they tried to move the mirror. I pictured them in a rental house in Hawaii, all palms and white towels and coordinated pajamas, clinking mocktails while explaining to one another that excluding me was actually an act of kindness, because I'm busy and independent, and I laughed, a quiet, surprised laugh that felt like an exhale after a long, unnecessary sprint. I wish I could say I slept, but I didn't, and instead of counting breaths, I counted the ways I had kept the family machine humming, the emergency cash I fronted when Tom's freelance checks arrived on island time. The evenings I sat with Mom while she rehearsed speeches about fairness she never delivered, the way I made a spreadsheet for the guest house utilities so Megan could see that electricity and hot water are not abstract ideas, but bills with due dates. And I realized, sometime around the hour when the sky turns from black to that diluted violet that reminds you the day is coming whether you're ready or not, that the only way to stop being the family's safety net was to fold it up and put it away, not with a tantrum, not with announcements, but with the kind of quiet logistics I have always excelled at. By morning I had a plan that felt less like revenge and more like a correction to physics, because if you remove the weight from one side of a scale, everything else has to readjust whether it wants to or not. I brewed fresh coffee, opened my laptop, and began where dignity begins in the 21st century, with access. One by one I signed into the accounts that had become invisible lifelines for Megan and Tom, the ones they used without shame and I maintained without comment, and I removed them from my home Wi-Fi network, my streaming profiles, my grocery delivery plan that had my default address set to guest, and the gas card I had added Tom to the day he swore it was temporary. And when a polite prompt asked if I was sure I wanted to revoke shared access, I read it like a question from a sleepy clerk and clicked yes with a steadiness that surprised me. It was petty only if you have never carried a family on your back while pretending you were merely offering a lift, and I admit, the moment my router blinked and the little list of connected devices shortened and the house went very, very quiet, a sparkler of satisfaction fizzed in my chest, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I wanted to see what they would do without the invisible concierge they had mistaken for furniture. My phone began to ping with the frantic, performatively casual texts that always follow a boundary. Hey did the Wi-Fi name change? Weird question about the gas app. Quick favor before we head out, and I set the device face down on the counter like a card I didn't intend to play. Then walked to the guest house window and looked at the suitcases they kept half-packed like they were always on the verge of leaving and thought, not yet, not today, soon. When the first call came from my father, whose voice has two settings, benevolent and disappointed, I let it roll to voicemail and pressed my palm against the cool glass, because I knew that removing a few digital comforts wasn't the endgame. Just the opening move in a different kind of holiday, one where my presence would not be managed like a risk, but chosen like a truth, and as the message icon glowed and the December light crawled across the floor, I decided to spend the rest of the day doing nothing dramatic and everything definitive, which is how, an hour later, I found myself standing in the guest house doorway with a roll of heavy-duty trash bags and a label maker, smiling at the neatness of it all. While my phone lit up again with Megan's name and a preview line that read, "Emily, what are you doing?" And I thought, if I answer now I'll explain, and if I explain I'll negotiate, and if I negotiate I'll end up right back where I started, so I didn't answer. Not yet, because the best part of a quiet plan is the silence before the hinge turns. I began with the drawers because drawers tell the truth about how people live. And the truth about Megan and Tom was folded into stretched t-shirts and half-rolled gym shorts and a collection of souvenir koozies from breweries Tom pronounced as if he were auditioning for a travel show. So I slid everything out in patient armfuls. Not throwing and not rifling, just sorting, because order has always been the only way I keep myself from drowning when the water gets high, and while the label maker clicked out their names in neat black letters, I realized how much of the last year had been spent pretending this guest house arrangement was temporary rather than a slow-leak occupation, where my generosity became the wallpaper and their gratitude expired with the freshness seal on yogurt. I boxed the things they actually used, bagged the aspirational clutter they had promised to organize soon, and set aside a thin stack of papers that should have embarrassed them, unpaid tickets and Tom's spiky handwriting, a boutique receipt for swimsuit shopping the week my mortgage tax bill hit, and a printed itinerary titled Ohana Christmas, with a column labeled Emily, left blank as if I were a volatile chemical someone was wise to keep off the list. When I carried the first bags to the carport, it struck me that the sky had the color of an old bruise, that deep blue fading into a tired gray. And I laughed a little at the melodrama of the setting, because even I can appreciate a heavy-handed backdrop when I am doing something that will be called heartless by people who never once asked whether my heart was tired. So I lined the suitcases along the wall like guests checking out of a hotel, printed a simple note that read, "Your things are ready." I'll text the pickup window, and pressed it under the handle of the bright coral roller bag Megan had bought on a buy-now-pay-later plan, the same plan I had quietly paid off when the late fees snowballed into a number with too many commas for comfort. Inside, I opened the hardware drawer, found the spare cylinders I had bought back when Tom lost his keys, and changed both the guest house deadbolt and the side gate lock, not with triumph, but with the buttery mechanical satisfaction of a task done properly. And while I worked, I remembered the afternoon last spring when my mother stood at this very gate and said, in that careful tone she reserves for requests she knows are unreasonable, that it would be so helpful if Megan and Tom could stay. Just until the market calms down, and how I had said yes, because the person I used to be did not know how to say anything else. The phone kept vibrating in little tantrums and I let it, because I had already used up my lifetime quota of explaining myself to people who were determined not to understand, and instead I moved through the space like a practical ghost. Unplugging the espresso machine Tom insisted was essential to his creativity, wiping the ring of sugar crystals off the counter where Megan parked her flavored syrups, pulling the plush throw off the couch because that throw was mine and I liked it, and finally, standing in the bathroom long enough to notice 3 expensive serums Megan had opened and abandoned after 2 days, which is a pretty fair summary of her relationship with responsibility, I put the little bottles in a box labeled Keep If Wanted and wrote, almost kindly, a reminder that everything unclaimed by New Year's Day would be donated, not as a threat but as a mercy to myself, a promise that the pile would not become a shrine to my inability to follow through. Because I am not cruel and because I am done funding denial, I printed a formal notice, the kind with real dates and politely firm language. And I tucked it into the same clear sleeve as a cashier's check refunding their remaining security deposit down to the last cent after deducting exactly what the original written agreement allowed for utilities and professional cleaning. And I did this with a focus that might look vindictive from the outside, but felt, on the inside, like finally picking up a spine I had set down years ago to carry other people's weight. I scheduled the smart thermostat to hold at a reasonable temperature so nothing would freeze or bake. I removed their profiles from my streaming accounts, but left them a week of access to a basic plan with their email addresses, so they could keep their shows without leeching off mine, and I texted Tom a single line, "Pickup window today 3 to 5. Gate code has changed. Check your email for the new one," then flip the phone face down again, and listened to the tiny drum line of message bubbles marching across the glass. Around midday, when the December light had sharpened and the house smelled like lemon cleaner and the kind of calm that comes only after 100 small, decisive acts, I carried the last box out and propped open the gate like the world's politest bouncer. And for a long minute I stood there with my hands on my hips feeling both older and newly minted, because there is a very specific silence that follows the moment you stop auditioning for the role of the reasonable one, and it is equal parts terror and oxygen. I sent my parents a courteous email instead of a text because I wanted a record, explaining that the guest arrangement had concluded as of today per the original terms, that the deposit check and invoice were enclosed, and that I would be unavailable for phone calls while I reset the property for future tenants, and I signed it with my full name the way you do when you are done being the family nickname. The revenge, if you insist on calling it that, was not in the boxes or the locks or even the check. It was in the elegance of refusing to be a character in the story Megan was writing, the jealous older sister, the buzzkill, the one who makes it awkward, and instead choosing to be the property owner, enforcing clear boundaries, and the woman who understands that love without respect is just a liability with better lighting, and I admit the satisfaction sharpened when I saw the confused rideshare pull to the curb and Tom step out with that injured look he wears like cologne, glancing from the luggage to the gate to the email on his phone, because there is a moment, brief and honest, when a man realizes the concierge has left the building and all that remains is a bill. He didn't ring the bell, which told me Megan had coached him to avoid confrontation and pivot to optics, and sure enough the calls began again, first from Tom, then from my mother, then the tone-deaf group ring Megan uses when she wants an audience, and I let them loop and fade while I wiped the last counter and folded the last towel and stacked the last labeled box, because what I wanted most, more than apologies and far more than drama, was proof to myself that I could end a chapter without throwing the book, and just as I was about to lock the side door and finally make myself lunch, there came that old, familiar knock, measured, paternal, a summons more than a request. And I didn't have to look through the peephole to know my father was on the other side of the wood gathering himself into the disappointed silhouette he believes is persuasive, so I put my hand on the knob, felt the cool brass like a small countdown in my palm, and opened the door to the man who raised me to be. Reasonable saying my name in the tone that had always worked before, and I smiled, not unkindly, because this time it would not. My father stepped into the doorway without waiting for the invitation he would have insisted on as a matter of courtesy if anyone else had tried the same move. And his eyes did that sweep of the room that pretends to assess cleanliness while actually gauging compliance. Then he settled into the posture I know from childhood doctor visits and parent-teacher conferences. The one that says this will be reasonable if you remember who you are supposed to be, and he began with my name as if it were a lever, drawing it out in that disappointed baritone that has, for many years, been the family's preferred substitute for an argument, but I had stacked too many boxes and changed too many locks to mistake tone for authority. So I let him speak his opening script about holidays, about grace, about the optics of bags on a curb, and when he finally reached the line where I was meant to fold, "Emily, you could have handled this privately. You've humiliated your sister." I stepped aside from the door and gestured at the neat line of luggage already loaded into Tom's rideshare, because nothing is more private than enforcing a boundary before the neighbor's dog even finishes its morning patrol. And nothing is more humiliating than the past year in which I became a backup generator no one thanked until it flickered. He tried the softer tack then, the one that quotes my better qualities back to me like a sermon on stewardship. "You always keep the family together. You understand logistics. You are the one we can rely on." And I could almost feel the old habit rising in my chest, that twitch that says it will be simpler to fix it, but I thought about the message thread from 2 nights ago and the blank column beside my name on the itinerary, and I refused the bait, explaining calmly that the guest house arrangement had reached its agreed end, that the deposit had been refunded to the exact cent after necessary deductions, that the gate code had changed and schedules had been communicated, and that all further questions could come to me by email so there would be a record, which is a phrase that makes my father wince because records become history and history is harder to gaslight than a phone call. And when he said the word family with the weight of a courtroom oath, I replied that family without respect is just a noisy club with dues, and he took a small breath through his nose as if he had swallowed a lemon seed by accident. My mother called while he stood there, and the phone lit up with her photo from a picnic 3 summers ago, the one where she is laughing at something Megan said about my boss energy, which is supposed to be a compliment, but always lands like a warning. And I let the call pass to voicemail because I did not intend to be triangulated into a role I had not auditioned for. Then I watched my father try out the practical approach, asking whether Tom could collect his tool bag later, whether Megan's garment bag had been included, whether I could, just for tonight, reactivate the Wi-Fi because there were bookings to confirm and confirmations to print, and I kept my voice level as I said that everything they needed was packed, that the Wi-Fi was for current residents only, and that printed confirmations are a wonderful tradition the airlines honor at check-in, and he blinked slowly not because he didn't understand, but because he did. And because he could see that the lever was no longer attached to anything it could move. He left with the dignity of a man who intends to call reinforcements, and I returned to the kitchen where the lemon cleaner had finally faded into something like quiet, only to have the silence broken by the brittle tink of the family group ring. A chorus of overlapping calls that meant my sister had staged a small theater in the group chat and needed me to be the villain in real time, and when I declined the call and opened the thread instead, the screen filled with the kind of frantic logistics they always mocked me for mastering. An airline delay had eaten the connection. The hotel had oversold ocean views and was temporarily relocating guests. Tom's preferred credit card had flagged the deposit as suspicious because he never tells the bank when he plans a big charge, and my mother, who has always insisted she does not understand points or miles, was suddenly fluent in reward tiers and asking whether my status could nudge anything, by which she meant save the day the way I used to do without being asked. It would have taken me 10 minutes to fix all of it, 3 polite calls and a calm voice and a promise to send follow-up emails, but I set the phone down on the counter and folded a dish towel instead, because revenge, for me, has never been about spectacle. It has been about refusing to subsidize other people's chaos with my competence. The messages changed tenor as the day wore on, sliding from imperious to pitiable in the space of an hour, with Megan insisting that the overbooking was an outrage, then hinting that if I had been with them, the resort would never have tried it. Then finally landing on the kind of apology that is more of an accusation. I'm sorry you felt excluded, but this is a family emergency and you love family, don't you? And while I read the words, I felt a small heat behind my eyes that had nothing to do with tears and everything to do with the exacting satisfaction of recognizing the trick and not climbing into the box. So I typed a single sentence that was neither cruel nor open-ended. I hope you get where you are going safely. I am not available to assist. Please contact the resort and airline directly, and I sent it without dressing it up. Without the smiley faces adults use when they want to be mean. In a sweater, without the cushioning phrase we all learned from our mother, no. Worries, because there were worries and none of them belonged to me. By evening the thread had quieted into that seething politeness that tells you alliances have been redrawn off stage, and I stood at the sink with the window cracked, listening to the winter air carry a distant siren and a closer sprinkler squeak, thinking about how many times I had written to concierges and managers and airline agents to rescue vacations I wasn't even on, and I realized that not answering a ringing phone can be a kind of music when the song has always been you doing the harmony. Alone, I poured myself a glass of not quite cold white wine, sat at the table with my laptop, and drafted a 2-paragraph note to future tenants about trash pickup and the fussy back porch light, and as my fingers moved I felt something uncoil. Some internal cord that had been wrapped around a pulley for years, and right then the phone, face down on the wood, buzzed again with a number I didn't recognize, an area code I couldn't place at first, and when I flipped it over and saw the city tag. Resolved to Honolulu, I hesitated for a single breath, then answered to a voice I had not heard since I chose my family's emergencies over my own life, saying my name with a laugh that remembered everything. And I stood up so fast the chair legs scraped the floor as he said, "Emily, it's Mark, and you are not going to believe where I am calling you from." Mark said my name the way people do when they are surprised by how easily an old door swings open, and before I could decide whether to sit or pace, he filled the line with the kind of cheerful competence that used to make me ache, explaining that he was on a balcony in Waikiki with a laptop balanced on a patio chair, that he had just come from a site tour which had involved 3 city officials, 2 attorneys, and 1 developer who spoke in metaphors about waves, and that he had dialed me. Almost by muscle memory after overhearing a Midwestern couple at the elevator complain about a resort overbooking policy that sounded suspiciously familiar, I told him, in a tone meant to suggest a casual holiday lull, that my family had tried a group trip experiment that did not include me, and he blew out a sympathetic breath and said he could picture exactly the faces in that scenario and that, if I was willing to accept it, there was a small mercy in not being on the plane for once since. This particular island adventure looked like an obstacle course constructed by people who enjoy watching others fall. We did not tiptoe around why we had stopped seeing each other, because the answer lived in the unglamorous space between my reliability and his patience, and while the light in my kitchen went gold and then gray, we let old conversations thread through new details, trading gentle admissions like souvenirs, until he laughed at something I said about lemon cleaner and revenge and asked, with the warmth of a man who remembers my better days, what Christmas would look like if I didn't spend it, corralling anyone else's disappointment. I told him it would look like a long walk on the bluff that becomes a cliff if you are not paying attention, a dinner I ate on actual plates instead of over the sink because I had earned the performance of ceremony, a cheap movie I might watch with the volume low, and a midnight where the only countdown belonged to me, and he said that sounded like recovery disguised as holiday, and that, purely coincidentally, he had a reason to be in my coastal town before New Year's because one of his clients had set their sights on a small portfolio of properties along the shoreline, nothing massive, just a cluster of charming rentals whose owners were tired of being landlords. And for a second my heart tapped the inside of my ribs because there are moments when the universe stops whispering and speaks in complete sentences, so I told him lightly that I knew a landlord who was assembling a tidy file for a potential sale, then stood very still while he said my name again and asked if we could talk business without collapsing the rest of the conversation into something we would both regret. We agreed, in the tentative way adults do when they are building a bridge they might actually use, that we would separate the personal from the practical with a pencil line and a phone calendar. And just as we were scheduling an afternoon call for the day after Christmas, my phone lit with the incoming avalanche of family messages, a blizzard of apologies and requests, and faux cheerful holiday photos in coordinated pajamas, as if a matching pattern could erase the last 72 hours of manipulations. And I watched the thumbnails march across the screen while Mark, who has known me long enough to understand my face without seeing it, said quietly that boundaries are hardest to keep when the violins start to swell, which is why you keep them anyway. I made my holiday small on purpose, a morning that began with coffee made the way I like it, and a walk that ended with wind-stung ears and a face that felt scrubbed clean by air. And I let the calls roll to voicemail and the texts sit unanswered like ornaments left in their boxes, because I have learned that you do not owe anyone access simply because your blood remembers their birthdays. Instead, I wrote the kind of list that looks boring and turns out to be a map, a line for the handyman who could handle the porch light, a line for the photographer who could document the guest house before I staged it, a line for the attorney who would review a simple sale agreement with clauses that protected me from the kind of last-minute reversals my family considers creativity. And by late afternoon, I had sent exactly 3 emails and felt more at ease than any Christmas I could remember, not because I was alone, but because I was not being tested by people who measure love in martyrdom. The day slipped into evening through the usual rituals, a movie with laugh lines I knew by heart, the tidy clink of a fork on a plate, the small shock of an empty, quiet house that did not feel like punishment, and just as I refolded the throw at the foot of the couch, a notification hissed across my phone with the gentle insistence of news that intends to be repeated, and my screen filled with a photo of Mark shaking hands in front of a banner whose logo I recognized from local planning meetings. The caption announcing a preliminary agreement to revitalize a section of my shoreline with mixed-use spaces and short-term rentals designed with, and this phrase did make me smile, unusually considerate neighbors in mind. I clicked through to the article more out of habit than appetite, and while a web page loaded with the patience of holiday internet, I felt the kind of quiet most people mislabel as loneliness rise in my chest and settle into something steadier. Because the story beneath the headline was not really about Mark, it was about investors who had learned that working with the women who actually maintain the properties yields faster approvals and fewer surprises. And there, halfway down, sat a sentence about a pending conversation with a local owner who had already demonstrated unusual mastery of logistics and community relations, which is a very polite way to say a woman who gets things done without scaring people, and the article did not name me, because that would have been too neat, but it did mention a guest unit with a separate gate and a history of being used by family members in transition, and I was halfway between a laugh and a long exhale when my phone rang again, not with a family ring but with Mark's number, and his voice, lighter than it had been all week, asked whether I was reading the piece and whether I was ready to talk terms while the ink was still warm, and, before I could answer, another call flashed on the screen. An incoming group ring from my sister and my mother and my father united in a single insistent wheel, and I looked at the 2 options pulsing across the glass like a test I had studied for, then said to Mark that I was absolutely ready and that, for once, my timing was perfect, while my family's call slid away unanswered into the quiet I had chosen. They came back in that post-holiday slump that makes airports smell like lost plans and reheated coffee, and by the time their ride turned onto my street, the rain had rinsed the sidewalks into a shine that made the suitcases look theatrical, which would have pleased Megan under other circumstances, except that nothing about her face suggested a woman ready for staging, and when she stepped out clutching a carry-on like an alibi, and Tom followed with the expression of a man who has finally met the bill for his own optimism, I watched from the porch with the kind of composed stillness I had always reserved for other people's emergencies. Because the difference now was that I had finally learned the trick of letting the emergency belong to the person who brought it. Megan started with volume instead of content, a tactic that used to work on substitute teachers and boyfriends and occasionally our mother. But she ran out of runway quickly, because shouting requires an audience and I have retired from that job. So she took a breath that rattled like a cheap blind in a draft and said they had been through a lot and needed a safe place to land, which is a phrase I have personally financed for longer than I care to admit. And I nodded as if we were discussing weather while unlocking the porch box and retrieving two large envelopes whose weight announced formality before I even spoke. I handed Tom the first envelope, because he is the one who reads fine print when a penalty looks likely, and I gave Megan the second, because she is the one who scans for flattery and misses the clause that matters. And I waited while their eyes moved at different speeds over language that had been chosen with the help of an attorney who does not drink during the week and believes in punctuation like a religion. The document said what needed saying without decoration. The guest arrangement was concluded. The property was entering a sale process. The new management company would require 30 days to transition, and any personal items not removed by Friday would be boxed and donated. And when Megan looked up with the outrage of a person who has mistaken kindness for a line of credit, I told her gently that I had accepted an offer for the guest house and yard from a company that intended to do something useful with them, and that I would retain a partnership interest because there is a very specific joy in owning fewer headaches and more equity. And I admit there was a moment, small and electric, when Tom's eyes flicked to the gate and calculated the end of free utilities. And in that moment I felt the exact weight of the years I had carried a household that did not belong to me while being described as independent, like it was a diagnosis. My parents arrived 10 minutes later with a casserole that had been frozen since Thanksgiving and a number of words that did not survive contact with the air. Because once my father saw the envelopes and understood that the shape of the future had already been bolted to the floor, he moved quickly from disappointment to negotiation and began suggesting compromises that involved me setting aside the sale for a season and allowing a brief reset under clearer expectations, and it would have been funny if it hadn't been such a depressingly accurate summary of our family's entire philosophy. Delay the consequence, rename the pattern, and call the result mercy. So I thanked them for the food, set it on the porch table like a museum piece from a culture that worshipped starch, and said I preferred to finish what I started, especially now that there were contracts with dates and signatures and penalties for nonsense, which is the kind of sentence that makes my mother's eyes water. Because she cannot cry for her own choices, only for my refusal to cushion them. Because I am not cruel and because closure is a gift as much as a boundary, I offered them something that looked like mercy and felt like math, a printed list of short-term rentals within walking distance of the property at winter rates, a line about a storage unit I had already reserved for 30 days in their names with the first month paid, and a note that their refunded security deposit had posted, minus the cleaning and utilities we had discussed in writing before any of this began. And while my sister processed the indignity of being handled like an adult, my phone buzzed with the soft insistence of a calendar reminder, and I excused myself to take a call from the balcony where the cell reception likes to pretend it lives on a cliff. Mark's voice came through steady and warm, and we moved through numbers and timelines and signatures with an ease that felt like muscle memory dressed in new clothes, and when he paused to ask whether I wanted to keep the hydrangeas or let the landscaper swap them for something less fragile, I surprised myself by choosing hardy over pretty because, as it turns out, I have developed a taste for things that do not wilt when the temperature drops. When I came back inside, my parents were at the dining table with the envelopes laid out like maps, and Megan had achieved that brittle calm that precedes a scene, and before she could begin the sort of speech that ends with the phrase, "We're family," spoken as if it were a court order, I told them I would hear any apology they wished to make, but that forgiveness, if offered, would not resemble reinstatement, and that no one would be moving back into anything I owned, not as a punishment but as a policy designed to prevent history from voting itself a second term. My father muttered that boundaries had become a modern obsession, and I replied that so had consequences, which is what people call boundaries after the fact. And my mother whispered that she wished we could start over, and for a long second I felt the ache of that wish land exactly where she meant it to, and I almost reached for it the way I used to reach for every heavy thing in the room. But then I saw, with a clarity that felt like waking, that starting over in this family has always meant starting me over as the soft place to fall, and I am not soft in that way anymore. They left with the casserole because I did not want the symbol, and the gate clicked shut with a satisfaction that did not require celebration, and I moved through the house turning off lights the way you do after a party that somehow managed to happen without laughter. And the quiet that followed did not frighten me, it expanded. It opened little doors in my chest where oxygen lived. And I stood at the kitchen window watching the hydrangeas tremble in a wind that promised weather, and I considered, not for the first time, whether I am the hero in this story or merely a woman who finally learned how to stop throwing herself between other people and gravity. The phone lit again with a message from Megan that contained the word sorry without a verb and an invitation to talk tomorrow about a second chance, and I stared at it long enough to feel my old reflex rise and then drain away. And I typed a reply that was as precise as a ledger and as kind as I could make it, that I hoped she would find the help she needed, that I would meet her for coffee next month if she wished, that nothing about the housing situation would change, and I sent it without ceremony. Then turned back to the sink where the last clean glass waited and the last small task insisted on being done. Later, as the house settled into the hour when pipes creak like old memories and the streetlights turn everything into a stage without actors, I opened the sliding door and let the coastal air push its way across the threshold. And I thought about the word second and how it suggests a sequence as well as a measure, and I realized I have spent years counting for other people, their deadlines, their favors, their almosts, while pretending I was bad at math, and now, at last, the numbers are mine. I do not know if my family will become different people or merely better at disguising the same impulses. I do not know if Mark and I will sign the papers and go back to our lives or sign the papers and hazard something braver. I do not know whether the hydrangeas will make it through the winter or whether the landscaper was right about salt and wind, and I am surprised to find that I am comfortable with not knowing, because certainty, I am learning, is just another way to avoid the present. And the present, this exact minute with the door open and the air moving and my phone quiet, feels like the first thing I have owned that no one else has keys to, which may not be the second chance they wanted, but it might be the only one worth taking.